On behalf of the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University and our numerous and proud sponsors tonight, the Ontario Jewish Archives, the Robart Center for Canadian Studies and the Department of History at York, and the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, welcome to all those who have joined us from far and wide this evening to learn with and from our esteemed guests, Professors Pierre Anctil and Richard Menkis, who have joined us to talk about their new book, In a Land of Hope, Documents on the Canadian Jewish Experience, 1627 to 1923, a monumental first for and an incredibly valuable contribution to the field of Canadian Jewish history, published this past fall by the Champlain Society. My name is David Kaufman. I'm the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry and the Associate Director of the Center for Jewish Studies, and a proud longtime colleague of both Pierre and Richard. The book we're celebrating and helping launch today is an assemblage of original primary sources, documents that speak in many different voices, scoured from archives coast to coast to coast, that together chronicle the origins and establishment of Jewish life in the lands that would come together under the cultural, legal, and administrative aegis of a nation state called Canada that came into being about halfway through the 3 centuries covered in this book. It's an incredible accomplishment. It has a brilliant introductory essay about the history of how Canadian Jewish history has been told, and very rich and helpful contextual descriptive notes to every single one of the 154 documents contained within it. The part of the country that I'm zooming in from today, in the Great Lakes region, where both the university at which I work and the home and city in which I'm fortunate enough to live are located, are party to an agreement among the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that predates the earliest sources in the book we're discussing today by about 500 years. That agreement, it's called the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, was made so that the people living in this region would forever peaceably share and care for the lands and the waterways on which we're all dependent. Toronto is also the traditional territories and very much the current homes of many other Indigenous nations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I'm going to introduce our guests more fully in a moment and ask them some questions about their new book for about maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, after which we'll open up the floor to questions and answers from all of you. But first, I wanted to invite Larry Ostola, president of the Champlain Society, the nearly 120-year-old Canadian historical organization and the publisher that both commissioned this volume and will publish its forthcoming companion second volume, to say a few words of welcome as well. Larry, do you want to come? Oh, there you are.
Thank you very much, David. Good evening, everyone. Shalom. I am absolutely delighted to be with you this evening here online on behalf of the Champlain Society. As David mentioned a few moments ago, for over 115 years since 1905, the Champlain Society has worked to echo the voices of some of Canada's most eloquent citizens. For centuries, explorers, merchants, public servants, scientists, ordinary people, and extraordinary men and women have left riveting accounts of their actions and thoughts. Through its books and digital collection, its blog and its podcast, Witness to Yesterday, the Champlain Society makes the adventures, explorations, discoveries, and opinions that have shaped Canada available to all those who have an interest in our past. These activities are in keeping with the mission of the Champlain Society, which is to increase public awareness of and accessibility to Canada's rich store of historical records. Last fall, we were really pleased and proud to have had the opportunity to publish what I think you will agree is an exceptional volume and a wonderful addition to our collection. In a Land of Hope, Documents on the Canadian Jewish Experience, 1627 to 1923, were offered in one volume an overview of Canadian Jewish history up to 1923. As you're going to hear during the webinar, this collection includes documentation from very diverse archives and in many languages, which account for the evolution of Canadian Jewry over 3 centuries and through a wide array of contexts and circumstances. It prioritizes numerous and diverse Jewish voices, from politicians to workmen and women from across the country, that expressed at different points in time the multiple realities of the Canadian Jewish experience. This first of 2 volumes, there's another one coming up in the near future, includes sources never before published and highlights the activities, concerns, and experiences of individuals that have not until now been heard. The history of Jewish life in Canada is an integral part of the broader evolution of Canadian society and is a very significant part of Canada's unique identity. I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely congratulate the editors of the volume, Richard Menkis and Pierre Anctil, for their outstanding work and scholarship. Through their efforts, they brought an important chapter of Canada's history to life for all of us. I'd also like to thank our general editor, Jane Arrington, for her hard work in helping to make this volume a reality. Finally, in closing, on behalf of the Champlain Society, I would like to express our sincere appreciation to David and all of the staff at the Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University for kindly organizing and hosting tonight's event. Thank you very much, and I hope you really enjoy the webinar.
Thank you so much, Larry. So now, welcome to our guests and the co-authors of this remarkable volume, Pierre and Richard. You guys can turn on your cameras. Very good. Nice to see you both. Pierre Anctil is a member of the Royal Society of Canada since 2012 and was a full professor of the Department of History at the University of Ottawa, where he taught contemporary Canadian history and Canadian Jewish history until 2 years ago. He's written at length on the history of Jewish community of Montreal and on current debates on cultural pluralism in Francophone Canada. His last 2 books before this one in English are Jacob Isaac Siegel, a Montreal Yiddish poet in his milieu, published in 2017, and A Reluctant Welcome for Jewish People, Voices in Le Devoir's editorials, 1910 to 1947, which was published in 2019, both at the University of Ottawa Press. His French language study of the history of Jews in Quebec, published in 2017, as Histoire des Juifs du Québec, appeared in the fall of 2021 in English under the title History of the Jews of Quebec. His books have received numerous awards, including the Judith Wordsworth Weiss translation, one for his Histoire des Juifs du Québec, which received a Governor General's Award. And Richard Menkis, an associate professor of Jewish history at the University of British Columbia. His publications include More Than Just Games, Canada and the 1936 Olympics, co-authored with Harold Troper. He's the author of numerous articles exploring the intersection of historical memory and the identities of Canadian Jews. He was the founding editor of Canadian Jewish Studies, Études Juives Canadiennes, the flagship journal of the field, the co-editor with Norman Raven of the Canadian Jewish Studies Reader, which won a Canadian Jewish Book Award. And he served as the divisional co-editor, again with Harold Troper, on the entries on Canada in the 2nd edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. Strongly committed to public history, Richard has also co-researched and co-written several museum exhibitions for the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center and has advised on many others. In 2018, he was honored with the Louis Rosenberg Canadian Jewish Studies Distinguished Service Award, and in 2023 received the Dean of Arts Award from his university, recognizing those whose contributions have proven to be transformative to their faculty. Welcome to you both. Nothing like this book exists for Canadian Jewish history, and as one of the few people who regularly teaches university courses devoted entirely to Canadian Jewish history, this book is an absolute gift. So thank you, first of all. I plan on redesigning parts of my course so that I can teach using the book. I thought we'd start with your motivation for taking on this project, and maybe you could share something of the backstory about how the idea for the book came into being, and how long it took, how easy or hard it was to pull it off.
Yes, well, I can begin. Almost 10 years ago, I was at Brandeis University. I was taking a summer program in Israeli studies, and suddenly Richard writes to me and he says, "I have an idea. Let's do a book that will document Canadian Jewish history." and on the model of others existing in other countries. And there I was in the middle of something else. So I said to Richard, it's an excellent idea, but you have to wait a couple of months before I'm back from this full intensive program. And we began right away. I think Richard had a very rich reservoir of texts. You just have to look behind him to see how much documentation he has. And we shared the effort in the following way. I concentrated on Quebec, Montreal, which is a key city in this instance, because going back to the earlier period, it was the largest Jewish city and the first one to appear with such importance. And then I scored the French documentation as well. And then Richard did the rest. What did you do, Richard? Tell us.
I don't know. There's Canada outside of Quebec. I don't. That's a small thing. Um, yeah, I mean, Pierre said that we started thinking about this quite a while ago. I mean, I had heard that there had been attempts, conversations before ours to try to do this. Not surprisingly, one of the people that was approached was Jerry Telchinsky, but for whatever reasons, it didn't work out. Well, variety of reasons. He was always so busy with so many projects. So I put it in the back of my mind, and then, like Pierre said, we're each coming with different strengths. So it was, and I've known Pierre for a long time. We both had hair, I think. So it was natural to try to combine our strengths to create this volume, with Pierre having done so much on Quebec, Montreal, 19th and 20th century. I had a little background on New France, actually, but also very interested in sort of I've actually come at Canadian Jewish history, and we all come at it from different directions. Pierre, to a large extent, from Quebec and minorities in Quebec, and me from sort of the longer sweep of Jewish history. So we each come with different strengths. And like I say, Pierre did Quebec. I was interested in everything else, and we made it happen.
You certainly did. Given that this book is the first of 2 volumes, an obvious question of periodization emerges right away for me. I actually have 2 questions here. The first is, why did you choose 1923 as the major demarcation date between the 2 volumes? And the second question is about the internal periodization you used in the book. So on the one hand, it's quite sensible and deliberate. For those who don't know, they separate the book into 3 periods that really reference local Canadian Jewish history, rather than use the key shifts that are normally associated with periodization in Canadian history. On the other hand, this is kind of using the kind of internal measures has produced something of a curiously uneven periodization, because the first period of the 3 in your book covers 250 plus years. The second is only 33 years, and the third is only 9 years. So I assume that's a byproduct of the number of sources that were available to you for you to use from the outset. But I want to back us up and ask about these periodization questions. What did the discussion or the debate between you look like about periodization between the books and within this book?
You want to start, Richard, with 1923? Why 1923?
Sure. Yeah, it's a pretty precise date, and it's maybe a bit more precise than we need to, but that is a year where some immigration regulations had changed in such ways that they became restrictive. Simultaneously in the background, and this is actually the last source that we have in the immigration section for that, there were so-called administrative refinements that were going on behind the scenes, in addition to the regulations. And when we looked at the 2 of them together, and then we also took a look, for example, at Rosenberg's Canada's Jews, and looking at immigration, I mean, it's pretty clear that the mid-1920s is a point where immigration drops off, which I think has all kinds of implications, religiously, culturally, politically, for the Jews. Once the Eastern European wave slows down, it's going to have a transformative effect, which is part of what we'll do in the later volumes. So that's the mid-1920s periodization.
Perhaps I can add the 1832 Emancipation Act, which was passed in Lower Canada and became really a seminal point in Canadian Jewish history, granting full legal and political and civil rights to Jews, took place when there were only 150 Jews in all of Canada. So for the first period, the population is so small, it reaches barely a few thousand people when we cut in 1881, because we felt that the Great Migration that begins late in the 19th century and then reaches all the way to World War I is really a transformative period because it brings the number of Jews in Canada to close to 100,000 very quickly. And it completely transforms the environment, the visibility of Jews. It creates Jewish neighborhoods. It creates a need for institutions. And most of that migration is East European, which is a break from the earlier migration, which is mostly British and German. So the East Europeans brought with them Yiddish. They brought with them a sensitivity which is late Imperial Russian. And for that reason, we felt that bunching together from 1881 to 1914 makes sense. After 1914, after World War I, there's a process that begins with large number of Jews, a process of institutional development. Canadian Jewish Congress appears in 1919. A whole new set of values. And Canadian Jews, it's strange to say this today, begin to realize that they're Canadian Jews. They're not recent immigrants only, and they have something in common to share. They have to defend their point of references. They have to educate Jews. They have to open the gates to immigration for further Jewish refugees and so forth and so on. So 1914 to 1923 is really also a massive transformation, and it leads, as Richard has said, it leads to the end of immigration, and from that point on, we'll see in volume 2, Jews begin to really Canadianize. Before 1923, it's a slow process. After 1923, it's a rather sustained process.
You've drawn the title from the book from one of the sources that appears in it. It's Clara Hoffer's memoir, Land of Hope. It's about her life in her Saskatchewan Jewish farming home in the early 20th century. Tell us more about why and how you chose to cohere the project as a whole around the keyword. Well, there's two keywords, land on the one hand, and the feeling or virtue or value or attitude of hope. As historians, I wonder, what do you think the idea of hope captures about Jewish history here in Canada until immigration restriction? And just as a built-in follow-up question, if you think you had 2 or 3 other virtues or feelings or attitudes to link with hope, what would they be?
Richard, it was your
Okay.
choice.
Yeah. Yeah, we were struggling to find a title. I think there's a half a dozen books that already have the title Canada's Jews, another half a dozen that have trees in them. So we kind of avoided those. In a Land of Hope, as you say, is used in another setting, and so putting it in quotes is to allude to the fact that it's already appeared elsewhere, but it's also to sort of say, it's aspirational. This is so-called Land of Hope. So that this is a concept that's more, we're not saying that it happened, we're saying that it was aspirational. And I think that it's sufficiently, I don't think that it's simplistic to say that people the Jews who found their way here, and settled here, they had ideas of changing and improving, and they had hope that they would have different lives. But it's not to say that we didn't call it, in the land of, the golden Medina or the land paved with gold, because, it wasn't the case. But to say that it was aspirational, I think, is legitimate.
I agree. It contained the promise. When this volume ends in 1923, it's still a time when Jews are hoping to get emancipated, to be treated equally, to contribute fully to their host society. And it's only beginning. It's only the very first steps. And we wanted the book also to be positive. So many histories of Canadian Jews insist on anti-Semitism and racism and obstacles. It's true, those exist and existed throughout the period, but insisting on progress, on advancement, on emancipation. One has to remember that most of the Jewish immigrants who came to Canada found themselves emancipated in Canada. It was the first time they were given the possibility of living in a liberal, tolerant society. We're especially thinking of Russian Jews who left an empire where Jews suffered all kinds of forms of discrimination, some violent ones too. Once they got into Canada, they hoped that their fate would improve. And that's how the book ends, 1923. That's the end of the Great Migration. And now we felt that contained, in a sense, in a nutshell, a message about that long period.
A volume like this comes together as a result of presumably continuous negotiations about what to include and how much of what is to be included, and how much and what's to be excluded. I think that's inevitable, it goes without saying. One curious absence from the pages of this book that struck me when I was reading it was the absence of the United States, about how living in the shadow of a Jewish community that was exponentially larger influenced or might have influenced or shaped Canada. Now, I appreciate that the point here is to tell a Canadian Jewish history, so it makes sense to exclude sources that speak about the US. Though for the sensitive reader, there are little bits of evidence, particularly in all the helpful notes that you include on the sources. But on the broader kind of theme and question about inclusion and exclusion, I'm hoping you can tell us a bit about your process. Like two brains can sometimes be better than one for these sorts of decisions. Then again, there's two of you with two sets of instincts and two positions from where you're coming from, as you mentioned earlier. Can you tell us about the harmonies and the dissonances between you guys when it came down to negotiating what's in and what's out?
Well, I think I'll start by saying that we worked really well together. I mean, it's also two different personalities. I was always convinced that we hadn't gone far enough, we haven't gotten near enough, that there's still everything is still problematic. And Pierre was very optimistic. So on the personality side, that was a perfect blend. I was always griping, and he was always smiling. So that was great. Then when it came to other things, like I said before, Pierre has worked so hard in understanding the Jewish experience in Quebec, and that the presence of Jews in Montreal, through much of the period that we're looking at, is so prominent that to defer to Pierre on Montreal, especially in the Eastern European phase, made a lot of sense. When it came, and also on questions of, I would say questions of culture, especially Yiddish language. I mean, Pierre, as you know, is a translator. I can read some Yiddish, and I found some Yiddish sources that I then gave to Pierre to translate. but then, yeah. So I mean, he had that particular strength, and then I felt like I brought, like I say, an appreciation of what was going on outside of Quebec. I also had an interest in pre-1881. Certain formative figures like Abraham de Sola. So that kind of informed that first part. And I also
Gradis as well.
The Gradis family from New France. But I also just really had a strong feeling like I wanted, it's easy to get words, it's hard to get voices. So I really wanted to find voices of a variety of experiences, including some that aren't, that we haven't focused enough on or haven't been highlighted enough. And so that led to other organizational challenges and decisions, some of which have been challenged and some of which we discussed, such as including women as a distinct section in the last two parts. But that was done to highlight that there's not enough that's been done on it. But look there are these sources, and that we tried to bring those forward. So again, Pierre had certain strengths when it came to Quebec, and I think I brought a certain sensibility of what Jewish life was like outside of Quebec.
Yeah, one of the challenges, David, was regional. Richard understood very well that there were Jewish farmers in the Canadian West, that the experience was not only urban, but it was also small town and even farms. He also had an understanding that besides the three major cities, Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg, when the period ends, there's not much that's been written or that's been included in the general narrative of Canadian Jewish history. So one of the strengths of Richard is that he brought very, very intense and, I would say, descriptive personal narrative about what it was to grow up outside of those three major cities. To answer you, David, about the United States, there's two elements which are really different that makes Canadian Jews or sends them in a different direction. First of all, Canada was part of the British Empire. And so Canadian Jews, and we see this at very important points in our narrative, had to be loyal to the crown. They had to be loyal in 1832 when the crown offered emancipation during the two invasions of Americans to Montreal at the time of the War of Independence, and again in 1812, 1813. And these were very difficult moments for Canadian Jews. And they had to be also living in a dual society where French and English, certainly in Montreal, coexisted side by side. So Jews could not integrate totally in Canada because Canada didn't exist as a unilingual, unicultural society. There's no one path as in the US. So that's very visible at times, that Jews have to think, oh, yes, but we live in a society where we have to take into account a French fact, a Catholic fact, and a separate province, which has French as the major language. And there's always these questions that linger in our history, which is why we favored working, and Richard and I, we brought this each in our own way. We had to work in four languages. We had to work in English and French and Yiddish and Hebrew. And that's typically Canadian, I think, as well. You wouldn't have seen this as intensely in the American narrative.
Hopefully, yeah, go
If I
ahead.
could just add, I mean, you asked about the American connection, and you've also asked about periodization. But let me just say that the last section, which, as you noted, is like, compressed chronologically, nevertheless, I think reflects something very important, which is that shares with the United States, namely that as historians now study World War I and recognize that the transformations of World War I have often been ignored, part of that transformation is that it puts North American Jewry, especially U.S. Jewry, in a new place in relationship to world Jewry. So in some ways, we're putting Canada with the United States implicitly as saying it is now a new region vis-a-vis the rest of world Jewry. So part of the reason for that chronology.
Yeah.
Hopefully our audience will indulge me like nerding out a little bit, but I'm curious about like how you actually made decisions about what's in and out. Did you guys have like a shared spreadsheet with, like we need to make sure that we're balanced in terms of region, in terms of categories? Did you how did you manage that? I imagine if it was me, I would be overwhelmed with trying to figure out how to get the balance right.
Well, I would say that there's not that much documentation to begin with before the 20th century. The Canadian Jews were not numerous, and as we know, many of them could not write in English or could not write, did not have access to large medias or to important institutions or universities. So we had to go deep down into certain archives, notably in the Jewish press, in English and Yiddish, to find what you're describing, a truly authentic Jewish voice. And it was very demanding, because in many instances that doesn't surface easily.
Yeah,
Would you
and
agree, Richard?
yeah, and I should say too, we were given a word limit, so there was that. I think we pushed the limits a little bit beyond. And then I think the other thing that happened was, I mean, ideally, you'd include as much of a document as you could and not cut out sections. However, it's a trade-off. If you do that, if you have full documents, you don't have the same variety. So part of what we did was we needed to edit the documents maybe a little smaller than ideally we would have liked to, but it was for that trade-off.
Yeah, agree.
I think my favorite single source in the collection is called Defiant Fiance in a Doctor's Office.
Yes.
It's an account for the audience who haven't read the book yet from Dr. Abraham Isaac Walensky, who was a very important figure in Toronto and in Canada's Jewish medical history. And he's recounting an episode in which a young woman and her betrothed and her parents set up a consultation with him, basically to police the young woman's status as a virgin. The betrothed don't seem to want to marry one another. It's clear from Walensky's writing about it in his memoir. And the young man wants to both humiliate the young woman in front of her mother and to be given the doctor's, medical imprimatur as proof that he can take into the community of his fiance's supposed moral breach. When the young woman has Dr. Walensky alone in the examining room, she basically says, "No, I'm no virgin, and you won't examine me." And then she convinces him, the doctor, to go to bat for her to hedge against this, disturbingly gendered shaming that would have surely fallen upon her. Now, I love that Walensky wrote about this in his own memoir, and I love that you guys included it as a source. And I found myself particularly riveted by this source at the intersection of Jewishness, medicine, kind of community feelings, community optics, and all the intrapersonal and intragender dynamics. It's just a wonderful source. I wondered if you could each tell me what your favorite source is in the reader, so that our audience can get a little bit of sense of the textures of these individual sources and maybe say a word about why you love it.
Here, go ahead.
Yes, I was very taken personally by the period of the Great Migration in Montreal, which is basically 1904 to 1914. And we found testimonials of young women, very young, barely adults, working in the garment industry, 60 hours a week and not earning much. And that's a very tempestuous period when unionization was taking place, when a very radical politics emerged in the Jewish community. We included also a passage from a newspaper describing a red flag parade of Jewish strikers in Montreal in that period, and many other such testimonials, which had not appeared before, and do reveal the intensity and passion which was felt by that generation that had to adapt in difficult circumstances and fought its way through discrimination and poverty, and to emerge in the next volume in very different circumstances. So that to me was very telling, and the very touching descriptions of these difficult circumstances appeared in an English language, non-Jewish newspaper of Montreal. So it's quite a lot on this that we found.
Richard, do you have a single favorite to pluck?
Well, let me just say that I mean the whole volume by Walensky. Um, I mean, I read it a long time ago. A lot of it just stuck in my mind, which is why sort of I knew that when it came to this, I wanted to include it. But that's not the only source that comes from that volume. He was more than a character. He also loved gadgets, and this got him into. This
And
is
he
a
was a
story not
filmmaker.
included. This got him into trouble. But he also had a tape recorder. So he recorded his mother talking about her. So he recorded his mother probably in the 30s or 40s talking about her experiences in the 1880s, 1890s in Toronto, having a store with her husband. So that, I mean, that for me was wonderful. But the other one that I really loved was the one where that I found when I was in Toronto and going through the records of one of these women's organizations, often well-off women who help poor Jewish women. And so out of this minute book, out of this record book in the archives, Ontario Jewish Archives, fluttered out this single page. And it was the page of a poor woman writing to them in broken English, asking for their help. And this voice from below, this voice of poverty just before Pesach, saying, you know, you told me it's a good idea to get some chickens. I'm going to try to do that, but I can't. I need your help. Please don't forget me. I just found it, you know, I just found it very poignant.
I'll remind all of our participants in the webinar that you can use the Q&A function. So there's a little button you can ask any question about the book, but frankly, you can probably also ask any question about Canadian Jewish history because we're fortunate to be hosting, I think I'm in safe ground to say, the two most eminent and important living historians in the entire world about Canadian Jewish
You're
history.
very kind,
No,
David.
I mean I
Yeah,
think that's just a fact. So for the 76 people who have joined us, you know, it's open season on interesting questions about Canadian Jewish history. I have a couple of more, and then we'll turn to the Q&A. Um, so I wondered about how important you thought it was to have non-Jewish voices in this documentary reader, and how you went about making decisions about what percentage of, you know, voices should be non-Jews thinking and reflecting on Jews, you know, which ones, if you could just sort of speak to the significance of the non-Jewish voice in a first-person documentary reader.
Yeah. There's a section which has many non-Jewish voices, and we felt that was important because there's the issue of how are Jews welcomed, how are they perceived, and what is essentially their place in Canadian society, and the Goyim have to answer that too. They have to become involved. So in Quebec, you have the voice of Henri Bourassa, who is a leading nationalist figure, and Notaire Plamondon. And we felt it was important. These not positive voices at the period, that would change in the next volume. In the next volume, there'll be, I think, many different approaches. Bourassa himself became far more positive in the 20s and the 30s. And it's important to sense also how Canadians were perceiving, reflecting, and evolving along the way as the Jewish population was growing and as Jews knocked on Canada's doors to be admitted, to be given equal status, and to be allowed to become citizens fully.
Yeah, and I think you asked earlier, you alluded to it earlier, question of anti-Semitism in Canada. I mean, we basically decided not to have a distinct section on. There are those two prominent voices, Bourassa and Goldwyn, you know, Goldwyn Smith.
Goldwyn Smith.
Goldwyn Smith, yeah. But we decided not to have a distinct section, but to have a section that we called in the public sphere, where we looked at how some non-Jewish voices raised challenges, whether it be, you know, about immigration, whether it be about Lord's Day Act or whatever, and how Jews responded. So we tried to get the voices so that they're interacting with each other rather than isolated from each other.
Right, and indeed many of the sources, I mean, the sources are about Jews' experience amongst themselves, but also with the publics in which they find themselves, the non-Jewish public. So you get a lot of Jewish, non-Jewish interaction by reading these sources very carefully. I have one small criticism about the layout of the book, but it's going to lead to a question. The criticism is that the sources themselves aren't parsed out in the table of contents. So readers who may want to browse for individual sources of interest to them have to find the listings on maybe like 13 different pages that are spread throughout the book. Now, it did make me wonder, will the source, maybe this is partly a question for Larry, will the sources be available digitally? Maybe can we work together to make them accessible and searchable, like in some kind of mini database? An open access ebook, maybe after a certain period of time, like say after university libraries have bought up their paper and e-copies. Maybe there's something that we shouldn't talk about when we have an audience, but I was wondering if we might anyway.
Well, you do have an index on which Richard and I worked very hard. Thematic and names, and plus newspapers and periodicals. So if you're looking for something more specific, the index will guide you to certain texts. If you have a name in mind, say Goldwin Smith, it will lead you to Goldwin Smith. And there's, I think, 4 on Goldwin Smith or 3. Likewise for certain periods. It's not easy because the spread is so large over 3 centuries. And as we say, there's a number of things that overlap. Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, I'd simply say that well, first of all, I'll say that I run the risk of running afoul of our general editor, and so I'm doing this with some trepidation. But I'll say that the comment's an interesting one, and it's certainly something I think we would be interested in thinking more about in preparation for the second volume that's going to be coming out. And if there's a way we can try and get at what you've suggested in a better way, we're all ears in terms of perhaps entertaining it.
All right, let's talk. We'll talk at some point when we're not recording. But I'm really interested in this question because I think it's important that all these sources be usable and accessible. You put them in a book, and that's wonderful. And there's all kinds of people that may use them in all kinds of interesting ways.
Yeah. All the sources are more than 100 years old. The last one is 1923, so there's no copyright anymore on them, and many are public. They're laws or declarations which were made by the governments. There's no copyright on them to begin with. It's going to be more difficult in the next volume for this reason.
And I'll emphasize what Pierre said. We worked hard on the index, kind of looked at the indices of several classics in Canadian Jewish studies to see what the headings were there, what the topics were there, and kind of integrated them, plus, of course, all the place names and people names. So there is that direction. But yeah, I mean, the Champlain Society basically told us we put together a volume which was almost too rich, and that they didn't want to make it unwieldy, but it suffers for the reason it doesn't suffer, but it's a challenge then to use for some people.
You know, it should be said also that we produce a general introduction and an introduction for each of the 3 sections. So if you're interested in a period specifically, reading the sectorial introduction will lead you to a certain number of elements, which we felt were important to underline.
Yeah, and I'll say for our guests who don't yet have a copy of this of the book that this general introduction and the 3 short section introductions are also, serve as fine introductions to these great, periods and your reperiodization of Canadian Jewish history. That's very helpful for readers that, introductory readers who aren't, fully well read in Canadian Jewish history, and indeed for specialists too.
You're very
Okay, so
kind.
my last question before we get to the Q&A, what did you learn about the process that will take with you in prep for volume 2? And can you speak about some of the unique considerations that you'll have to take into considerations, because there's so much more material, including the material that's digitally born, if depending on how far you're going to go up to in volume 2.
Go ahead, Richard.
You're right. It's going to be a different kind of challenge. There's going to be more of it. Um, I I think we'll just continue with the process that we've had. We'll each bring our insights from the regions and the areas that we work on the most. We'll get direction from the Champlain Society, how many words we're allowed to have, and then we'll try to find that sweet spot where not too many sources, but not to have them too short or too long, and to try to do something like representation. Now, some of it's going to be a shift. I mean, you're going to be talking about not if you're talking about demography, you're not going to be talking about necessarily Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg all through this period in that same order, but rather Toronto, Montreal, Winnipeg, Vancouver, whatever. So there'll be some ways in which demography will dictate some of the shifts that take place. But also, I mean, there's going to be obviously some natural divisions, period in terms of periodization, um, pre-World War, World War II, immediate post-war period. So we'll learn from what's already been done, and then we'll just keep on negotiating.
I would add that Richard and I have been negotiating on how to represent the uniqueness of the Montreal situation after World War II, and how Montreal Jews come to terms with Quebec nationalism, how they engage in dialogue with Francophones, and what's specific about that unique region. The school question, which was something which is really unique to Quebec, and the fact that there was a large Francophone migration from Morocco in Quebec. So we're going to probably have to delineate the regions more. And a Canadian Jewish identity is something that is elusive if you want to consider it globally. There are strong regional factors, and there's strong also provincial factors.
I'm very much looking forward to seeing the periodization or how you section everything out. I think it'll be an interesting challenge, and I'm curious to see what you guys do with it. Any ballpark sense of when we might expect this volume? We won't hold you to anything, but just to give our readers a sense.
Larry,
We've begun our year, haven't we?
We received recently communications from Jane that it would be in 2027. Am I right?
That's what I remember.
Yeah, yes, Pierre, that's the latest information that I have in terms of scheduling. So you have a little bit of extra time, I think.
Yeah, and it will be used, believe me.
Okay, I've got some questions from our audience. I'm going to read them out, and with I guess I'll assume permission from the question askers to mention their names in case you guys have connections with them. So Anne Dublin says, "Thank you for explaining the cutoff date, but please explain why you began this book in the year 1627. Was that the year when Esther Brandeau came to Canada? In connection with that question, is she considered to be the first Jew to arrive in Canada?"
You want to
Pierre,
answer
take that one.
Yeah, Richard?
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Pierre.
Okay, so Richelieu was the regent of France, and he founded a society in 1627. So Quebec City was first reached in 1608. In 1627, furs are much in demand, so Richelieu creates the sans associés. And in the document, which creates the organization, the commercial organization, which will have the responsibility of bringing French settlers, he mentions that there should be no Protestants and no Jews in the colony. So that's quite an important point. Although we know some came, and one is Esther Brandeau. She came in 1738, almost 100 years later, and we have a first mention in a written document clearly stating that a Jewish person has reached Canada. And because of the prohibition contained in the 1627 Act, she was sent back to France. And these are events which have very little impact long term, because we don't know what happened to Estelle Brandeau after 1739. The Jewish population of Canada begins to develop only after the conquest and the arrival of Aaron Hart and a few others in the mid 18th century. So
Yes. Yeah.
much
So,
later.
yeah. So those early documents essentially establish an absence, right?
Exactly.
Why the Jews are not there.
Exactly. But
Where
we have
Jews
to
are
mention
explicitly named.
they're named and they're given
Mhm.
they are features of a document. But
Yeah.
we have to wait until 1832 to have an emancipation document.
Barbara Silverstein asks, are there records of people who came to Canada after escaping the pogroms? And did they have details of the pogroms that they witnessed and family members or friends that they may have lost?
What do you think,
Uh,
Richard?
I mean, obviously, a lot of our story starts on the ships coming, and we dealt with the ships coming to Canada. We didn't do a lot before that. Um, I would say that once you get into the 20th century, you're going to have a lot more, like not so much 1881. Once you start getting 1903, 1905, you're going to have a lot of documentation, not just about the present, but also of the connections back, what they lost. Occasionally, by the time you get to 1910s, 1920s, you might even have an Eastern European Jew who's well enough established to go back to Eastern Europe. So, not so much, I would say, 1880s, 1890s, more once you get past 1903, 1905, which were also a major impetus to more Eastern European Jews coming to Canada specifically.
Yeah, I didn't find anything myself because the pogroms existed, we know that, but the numbers of persons directly affected by a pogrom who witnessed a pogrom or were victim of a pogrom is much smaller than, say, what happens after World War I or what happens during the Shoah. Maybe that exists, but it's very difficult to find. Most young immigrants left places where in the Jewish Pale of Settlement, not necessarily following a pogrom, but rather following the insurrection of 1905, which is a much broader phenomena and which was a very violent phenomena. So we do find references to the insurrection of 1905, and that's more that it's more this type of event that we document than specific programs in specific places and Stetler.
Faith Jones asks, what do you think this book can provide in the teaching of Canadian history outside Jewish studies? And how, what do you think of how it can be used with students who may not have any background or knowledge about Jews or Jewish Canadians?
Well, what we've tried to do, and the second volume will certainly play that role also, is to show how it integrated this Jewish narrative is to Canadian history. How much Jews entering the country were informed of what was expected of them, what they could achieve, and in that sense, it's a contribution to the diversity of voices within the larger Canadian milieu. It's the first volume that the Champlain Society has done on a non-French Canadian Catholic, non-Anglo-Protestant community. And that tells us that we're more aware of these elements, more aware of the diversity of Canada. So it is a contribution to more broadly the fact that especially after the beginning of the 20th century, people came to Canada with vastly different backgrounds from vastly different places, and their contribution has to be understood in that light.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that if you're teaching quote unquote general Canadian history, for whatever period you're doing, if you're interested in the period of New France. Well, if you want to understand New France from another perspective, well, then you say, well, what about why weren't the Jews allowed at that time, right? So when you talk about the period before 1881, where the where English um, orientation to Britain was so important in general in Anglo-Canadian society. Well, if you really want to see it another way, is to take a look at the ways in which Jews like Abraham de Sola and others looked to London and saw their aspirations associated with London. So it's another way of viewing all these other issues um, through the eyes of a minority negotiating it. And because it's a non-Christian minority, it gives it another flavor too.
Yeah,
So you may
exactly.
not need to know, that your students may not need to know a lot about Jews or Jewish Canadian history in order to integrate sources that speak to the Jewish experience. That can be just sort of standalone introduction. Anne Dublin also asks, she wonders about, during your dive through various sources in different languages, if you noticed contradictions between one source or another, different points of view that are being articulated in different language, or maybe just more broadly from different sources about the same topic or theme. And if you did, how did you choose, which document to include in the book?
Well, there are basically two types of documents. Those produced by the elite, such as, for instance, the discussions on Canadian Jewish Congress in 1919 was done by well-established and often English mother tongue Jews who sought to organize to give sense to the entire movement taking place. And we have sources from common folks who came by themselves, who only represented themselves. And so that's very, very different. How was the store tended? How did you run the farm? Or how did you manage to become unionized and so forth, so on. So these are very broadly different categories. And more often we found the contribution of the common folk was dominant in this period. It's before the more important institutional federations, before large Jewish communities appeared, and before philanthropists, important wealthy philanthropists played a role. It's more a grassroots period, broadly, I would say.
If I can just add to that. Yeah, I would say that this idea of triangulating sources and getting a number of sources converging in one place is something I'm very interested in for a later period, but it's much harder to do for the earlier period. But what we did, and David alluded to the story which he appreciated of the Jewish the husband to be the woman, the fiance. I mean, you try to get stories which show sort of the conflict in them. Or even Pierre mentioned the founding of Canadian Jewish Congress, which was orchestrated to a certain extent from above. But we included in there some very strong debates by a non-Zionist who everybody wanted to drum out of there, and then they had to deal with that. So we don't necessarily have different sources, but we tried to find sources that might include indications of different voices discussing or conflicted over one issue.
Yeah, one interesting element you will find is the labor Zionists, or the Politicion. We included documents which were rather radical for the time, very anti-capitalist, even Marxist to a degree. And then you look at the other side and you see for instance, the De Sola family, by the time they reach the late 19th, early 20th century, they represent a very well-established, very, I'd say, fortunate. They have a certain amount of influence, and they collide with the very union-oriented, very militant Jewish working class, and that's in the book as well. So the many, it comes from many directions, and there's quite a bit of debate in the community, even among Zionists. Certainly, in the garment industry when owners who are Jewish meet workers who are Jewish as well.
We'll take a tiny minute a break from questions for just some expressions of appreciation from Olga Stein, from Susie Young, from Rosalind Wallach, who all say that this is fascinating and immensely important book, who thank you, who feel fortunate that saw the announcement and could register and attend the webinar, people who know very little about the history of Jews of Canada and who look forward to buying the book, and for an interesting conversation. Okay. Appreciation pause. Very nice. I'm sure you speak for everyone on the
Thank you.
call as well.
Thank you for those kind words.
An anonymous attendee asks about, she says that Anglophones too often assume that the immigrants had to fight anti-Semitism. Specifically, Francophones are labeled anti-Semites. Is there any evidence from this in Jewish immigrants, or maybe how did the immigrants themselves perceive Francophone and Anglophone anti-Semitisms?
Yeah, it's too early in the period we developed to really speak of anti-Semitic movements in French Canada. That would take place in the 30s with Adrien Arcan and others. And as the numbers grew in Canadian cities, there appeared in various places, based on different sources, there appeared movements within anti-Semitism. My understanding is that French Canadian was based on different sources. It was based on Catholic sources and French language, and it was basically anti-Judaic as opposed to racial, and that Anglo-Protestant sources were different from anti-Semitism. This we will best document in the next period. It's very difficult to do, at least for French Canadians before the 30s. There's not much that really appears. You're looking at the next period when you're asking this question. And it's a very important question. Is what's the origins, what's the source, what's the potentiality of different forms of anti-Semitism in Canadian society, whether in French or English, Protestant or Catholic, or racist, or I mean, there are many, many possibilities.
So I'm thrilled that there are like 10 more open questions. I'm gonna have only one person answer each one so that we can try to get through them all
That's
from
correct.
here. Lila says she came in late, but she wanted to know if you included Jewish homesteader immigration in the prairies, material about the Dominion Land Act, etc.
Richard.
Yeah, I mean, we included stories of settlers who tried to make a go of it with farming. Again, it's hard. I mean, there's in a land of hope, but we also included reports made by one of these people who came to check and see how well the farms are doing. And we tried to include reports that show different levels of success in agriculture. And so we include that there. And on the rural side, we also included one of the small towns in the prairies often had two notable sort of mercantile institutions. One of them could be a Chinese restaurant, and the other would be the Jewish General Store. So we do have a small memoir of the general store and a nice photograph as well.
Gerald Stone asks if you can speak about the state of archival resources across Canada in researching this volume, briefly about the strengths and weaknesses about the archival capacity.
It must be said, for those who know or do research in other minority histories, that the Jewish archives are very rich, that the amount of written material left by Jews defies imagination. And since the 30s, they've been largely preserved, and we could count on very competent historians and archivists to help us along the way. And there are many, many extraordinary resources. The book couldn't have been done without the effort made by archivists and communities and synagogues in preserving the record. It's a very, very important record, and we depend on it to produce this history.
Leslie Simpson has another source-based question. She wonders about what kind of material there is from women, specifically in terms of personal letters, diaries, and business correspondence. And she'd like to know where this material is primarily found.
Go ahead, Richard.
Well, yeah, I mean that was the uphill battle, was to find materials just like that. And so look through newspaper accounts, if there was letters to the editor, descriptions of strikes. Um, as I said before, the oral history that Walensky did with his mom, going back to a store in the 1880s. I mean, we had to search high and wide. In the middle of one of the collections from the Jewish Historical Society of Western Canada, there was one story that I found of a woman peddler in that region, and so we included it. So we had to reach far and wide. There are several memoirs that are out there that go back into our period. One of them was that we used as well was Molly Lyon.
Appreciation break number 2. Gloria Pascal says, thank you, so interesting. Vivian Felsa says, congratulations, Pierre and Richard, on the publication of your book. I look forward to reading the actual one. And Deborah Ostrovsky takes us from an appreciation to a question. Just thanks you so much for this interesting discussion. And she asked the question about if the book discusses the emergence of any Jewish Canadian literature, artistic life, poetry, theater, newspapers, the stuff that's written in this period before 23, or wonders if this is a little early for finding documentation about this life, artistic life. And Zach Baker has a similar question about, is this, or especially the next volume, to what extent you intend to cover sources on cultural manifestations in various languages about literature, visual art, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you're right. It's a bit early, 1923. The first book of poetry in Yiddish in Montreal was 1918. In Winnipeg, it was 1917. So it was barely beginning at the end of the period recovering. In English, in terms of Jewish literature, there wasn't much either. The documents that Richard described in A Land of Hope is much later, in the 50s and 60s. And so we do see artistic and literary, I would say, creation appearing mostly after the 20s in 3 languages, Yiddish, English, and French. And that is not yet something that the recent immigrants from Eastern Europe could manage to produce as soon as they arrived. But we tried hard, and we found elements which existed in Yiddish from a number of sources for the period. It's very small.
I would just quickly say that by including information about libraries and about schools and about the newspapers, we did try to engage some of those cultural issues.
Yeah,
there's a link in the chat, I'll remind everyone, to the book itself. And on the homepage of the book, you'll notice that it has a breakdown of all the sources, so you can get a sense of the contents if you're thinking about buying the book or want to have a closer look. There's a couple more questions about specific inclusion exclusions. Jerry Friedman, I'll ask them together. Jerry Friedman wants to know if you found documents regarding synagogues adapting to life in a liberal democracy. Eleanor Lobo asks if you included sources on the role of the Baron Hirsch Fund in Montreal. And there was one more.
Why don't you do
ask those two?
Go ahead. Go ahead, David.
So just
why don't you do the synagogues?
Yeah, I mean, I'll very, very briefly. Yeah, I mean, if in the first section already, if you take a look at one of the sermons from Abraham de Sola, he's very much engaging. This is what it means to be a Jew in this period in a time of emancipation. So, I mean, and it's specifically one that relates to Passover, timely, I guess. But I found that to be a very rich source looking at that particular issue for that particular time. Pierre?
Yes, with the Baron de Hirsch, we reproduced a complete report, a complete annual report for the early 20th century, very, very early in the 20th century. And it shows the extent of the involvement of the Baron de Hirsch in so many different activities, in welcoming immigrants, in educating young people, educating adults, and helping Jews cope with poverty, with lack of support, remaining Jewish. It is an immense organization with enormous efforts and power. So that, yes, the Baron de Hirsch is quite covered, as it appeared as soon as the Baron himself made his donation in the late 19th century.
I just add one more source to the question of synagogues as kind of religious adaptation. You have a great excerpt from Moses Hart's book, Modern Religion, this deist book from, I think, 1815, 16, around there,
Yes.
which is a really fascinating, great example of the question. All right, so Barbara Silverstein wants to know why Montreal became a Yiddish center as opposed to other cities in Canada. Maybe Pierre,
Yes, well,
that one.
yes. Montreal became the largest Yiddish center after New York in North America. Again, most of that will be in the 20th century after 1923. The Canada Radler, the Yiddish newspaper, was 1907. The Yiddish schools appeared in 1314. The Jewish Public Library, which is a Yiddish institution, in 14. So we're very much at the end. But the reason for this is that Canada had Montreal as the largest industrial center at the time. It was the largest Canadian city. It was on the Atlantic seaboard. So as Jews came in, they could find jobs easily in Montreal, and half of the Jews coming to Canada in the Great Migration settled in Montreal. And it was conducive because of the liberal environment. Jews could publish any language they so wished. But it was also because of the dual nature of Montreal. It was difficult for Jews to become Anglo-Protestants or to become Franco-Catholics. So they remained among themselves and did concentrate on their own heritage a bit more than they would have in other circumstances in other places. So more next volume.
Great question from Dalit Newman, who wonders, on the whole, how would you describe how Jews were perceived in Canada in this pre-20s period as a race, a religion, an ethnic group? Like how were Jews thought of by Canadians in general?
All of the above. I mean,
Exactly what I would have
this
said.
was a period of transition, where there were a variety of voices. Goldwin Smith, for example, took pride in keeping up to date on the latest developments of anti-Semitism in Europe, and had somebody feeding him information of what was happening. So he was very much turning towards the kind of new racial and political anti-Semitism. At the same time, one of the largest pressure groups in Canadian history before the Second World War, at least, was this Lordsdale Alliance, which tried to push for having everything closed up on a Sunday. And when Jews pushed back, there was a very strong response religiously, right? That this is a Christian country. You're a non-Christian group. So in Anglo Canada, I mean, Pierre can speak better to French Canada. In Anglo Canada, both of them were taking hold in different ways. The missionaries too, more of a phenomenon in English Canada than in French Canada. They challenged Jews, sometimes saying, we'll help you materially, but spiritually you're still inferior. And Jews then had to respond. So they were both happening at the same time.
Exactly.
Two questions about the next period, which not about this book, but I'll ask them anyway. Anne Dubin hopes that in the second volume you'll include documents about Morris Sachs and the Canadian Jewish Farm School in Georgetown, Ontario. She says that she's got two fat binders with info if you'd like to borrow them. and she
Mhm.
supplies an email address. Maybe you can, and why don't you email me? I'll put my email in the chat and I can forward something, or you could probably find these professors' email address if you just Google them. She says she's looking forward to reading the book. And another question about the next period from Hadassah Danit O'Reilly, who says that she's researching anti-Semitism and art in Canada. And I guess she's particularly interested in imagery, and she's been fairly limited in her research so far, but she's curious if you have any tips for digging deeper from the 30s afterward.
Well, there was a very strong, what we call a Jewish school of painters in Montreal. I think that also existed elsewhere. But a book was published on the Jewish painters by Esther, not Brando, Esther Delille. No, not Esther.
No.
What's her? No, I'm all wrong. I just forget. But you'll
Trépanier,
find
I
it.
think. Trépanier.
Trépanier, merci, Trépanier. So that didn't produce anti-Semitism. What did produce anti-Semitism is the press, and you will find caricatures, and you will find a visual depiction of Jews. For instance, in the Arcan newspapers of the 30s, and probably in other places as well. It's not really art, but art was sometimes used, caricatures or descriptions, to diminish or to attack Jews, and not in the higher forms of art, but in lower forms, if I may say so.
I love this question because it's suggestive about the nature of different kinds of document or different kinds of sources that can be used as historical artifacts, and it does make me think, oh, perhaps for the next volume you might consider developing something like a website that has sources so that you can have not just textual sources but audiovisual sources, little excerpts from radio sources, film clips, music. I mean, there's so much that happens in the next period that's not strictly documentary text. And it would be wonderful to have, a little mini, well-curated archive of sources that include non-textual ones. So maybe worth considering. I won't hold you to it. That's a steep challenge, but that would be interesting.
Well, it would
It-
also depend on, maybe, you were talking about a different kind of relationship with the Champlain Society in terms of presenting sources. That might be, a website, a curated website with those kind of links, that could be done. I mean, I've been spending a lot of time listening to radio broadcasts from the Second World War.
Yeah.
Yep, they were there.
And if you're interested in voice, and texture and visuality and, you can material culture, there's just anyway, great stuff. Great stuff. Okay, it's 8:20 here in Toronto. We've been at it for an hour, close to an hour and 20 minutes. So I think I'm going to call it here. I wanted to thank you again on behalf of all of our co-sponsors and us at the center for a wonderful discussion, and most importantly for producing this absolutely amazing book. There's a link to the book, and tonight only there's a discount code for, I think, the paperback version, the soft cover and the hardcover. So for those of you who are just looking at it now, I'll give you another moment there it is again in the chat, to open the link now, because when we turn off the webinar, the link will be gone, and to scratch out on a piece of paper the discount code. The 30% off the hardcover is launch84HC, and the discount code 20% on the paper book is launch84PB, paperback.
This is the hardcover.
Yeah, that's the hardcover. This is the softie. Pierre and Richard, again, congratulations. It's great talking with you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to everyone. Good night.
And thank you for the questions
Thank
and
you.
the organization of the conversation. Thank you, David.
And for your enthusiasm and support for the book. It's great. Thank you.
Well, good night, everybody.
Okay, goodbye.